I still remember the moment I realized everything I had built was gone. The apartment keys felt heavy in my hand, like a cruel reminder that the place I had called home for years no longer belonged to me. My husband's last words still echoed in my ears, cold and final, leaving no room for negotiation or mercy. I stepped onto the sidewalk, dragging the few bags I owned, feeling the sting of judgment from strangers and the heavier sting of abandonment from my own family. No one called, no one checked in. I was invisible, discarded. My friends, once so close, now avoided my messages, as if shame could be contagious. The city I had loved suddenly felt hostile, a landscape of cold windows and hurried footsteps that reminded me I had nowhere to turn. Hunger gnawed at my stomach, but it wasn't just food I was lacking. It was dignity, trust, and the sense that I still belonged anywhere. Every step I took felt heavier, like the world itself was pushing me down, reminding me I was nothing. I clutched my coat tighter, feeling its thin fabric failing to shield me from both the chill of the night and the weight of my humiliation. I tried to tell myself this was temporary, that it would get better, but the lie felt hollow. Tears pricked my eyes, hot and relentless, as I wandered the streets, searching for a bench, a doorway, anything that could offer even a momentary respite from the judgment that seemed to follow me. The thought of calling my parents crossed my mind. Brief, fleeting, quickly dismissed when I remembered their cold dismissal at my wedding, their indifferent glances when my ex-husband humiliated me in front of them. I was alone, completely, utterly alone. And in that solitude, a strange clarity emerged. If the world had abandoned me, I would have to find a way to rise without it. I didn't know how, but I knew I had no choice. The night pressed around me, heavy and unyielding. But somewhere in that darkness, I felt the first flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Determination. The city had thrown me away, but I refused to let it define me. Step by step, I moved forward, heart pounding, humiliation burning behind my eyes, carrying nothing but the memory of what I had lost, and the fragile, stubborn spark of what I might still become. Even as I trudged through the cold streets, memories of my past kept replaying in my mind, sharp and unrelenting. I remembered the way my parents always looked at my ex-husband with that approving glow, as if he were the golden child, and I was just a shadow lingering on the edges. Every holiday, every celebration, there was always a comparison. "Why can't you be more like him?" they would say, their words slicing deeper than any argument I'd had with my husband. I tried to shrug it off at first, convincing myself that family always teased and compared, but the pattern was relentless. My ex-husband, with his charm and arrogance, seemed to soak up all the praise, while I silently carried the weight of disappointment that everyone placed on me. At home, he rarely looked at me with anything other than irritation or impatience, dismissing my ideas, my career, my dreams. When I brought up my own hopes, he would laugh or change the subject, leaving me feeling small and unseen. Financially, I was often left scrambling, contributing quietly while he made the big decisions, spending recklessly, and making me feel guilty for questioning a single choice. The moments that haunted me the most were the gatherings where family members would openly favor him. Smiles and praise directed at him while I sat quietly, trying not to be noticed, trying to convince myself I was enough. I remembered the sting of the holidays, the birthdays where my efforts went unnoticed, the times I had been mocked for spending carefully while he flaunted extravagance, and the feeling that no matter what I did, I was always one step behind, always inadequate. At work, friends noticed my exhaustion and sadness, but no one truly understood the emotional erosion happening at home. My own parents' subtle, snide comments, their constant comparisons chipped away at my confidence day by day. And yet, I had stayed, believing that love could overcome neglect, that loyalty could rewrite indifference, that enduring humiliation would somehow earn respect. But now, walking the streets with only the clothes on my back, I realized that enduring it had not made me stronger. It had left me hollow. I had given everything, time, effort, heart, only to be discarded. Every memory, every slight, every laugh at my expense, fueled a growing fire within me, the first real emotion I had felt in weeks beyond the cold, numbing despair of my current reality. That fire whispered one word: justice. I didn't yet know how or when, but I understood that the world had been cruel and unjust to me, and that cruelty would not go unanswered. The first night on the streets was a blur of hunger, exhaustion, and shame. I wandered from one dark alley to another, clutching my meager bags, hoping to find some corner or doorway that could offer even a moment of safety. Every discarded blanket, every shadowed stairwell, became a potential refuge. But the chill cut through my thin coat like a knife. Hunger gnawed relentlessly, a constant reminder that I had no one to rely on. Not my family, not my so-called friends, not even the man I had once trusted to be my partner. I learned quickly which soup kitchens served the earliest, which shelters had the most crowded floors, and which streets were safest after dark. But safety came at a price. Embarrassment, constant scrutiny from passers-by, and the relentless fear of being judged as worthless. People looked at me with disdain or pity, and I felt both, a corrosive combination that made every step heavier. I watched families laughing, couples walking arm in arm, friends sharing coffee and warm meals, and I felt the sting of exclusion, the sharp pang of FOMO. Once, a group of wealthy teenagers in expensive coats tossed a coin my way, as if I were part of the scenery. Not a person, and I realized that no one truly saw me. Every glance reminded me of the stark contrast between my life and theirs, of the status I had lost, of the comfort I had been denied. Even the smallest kindness, a spare sandwich, a warm smile from a volunteer, brought both relief and a bitter reminder that my life had been stripped bare. Nights were the hardest. The streets were alive with the sounds of people who didn't know my name, who didn't care about my story, who didn't pause to consider that I had once belonged to a very different world. I curled up under tattered blankets, trying to imagine a future where I wasn't invisible, where I could hold my head high instead of hiding in corners. And yet, amid the despair, a stubborn part of me refused to break. Each humiliation, each pang of hunger, each glance of disregard only fed a quiet determination. I would survive. Somehow I would rise again, even if the world had cast me aside, even if everyone had forgotten my name. For now I endured, scraping together the fragments of life I had left, feeling the weight of loss, but clinging desperately to the faintest spark of hope. I had been hunched against a brick wall for hours, trying to make sense of the relentless cold and the gnawing emptiness in my stomach, when I noticed someone approaching. At first I assumed it was another passerby ignoring me, another face that would not see me at all. But this figure was different. Well-dressed, confident, carrying an air that made me feel simultaneously invisible and exposed. My heart thumped in wary anticipation as he stopped just a few feet away, eyes scanning me with an intensity that felt almost uncomfortable. Then he spoke, and the words stopped my heart mid-beat. "Are you Sophia?" he asked, his voice calm but insistent. "You just inherited $47 million. I stared at him, frozen. My mind a tangle of disbelief, confusion, and rising panic. My first thought was that this must be a mistake, some cruel joke or scam targeting a homeless woman. I opened my mouth to protest, to tell him he had the wrong person, but the words caught in my throat. Could it really be true? In that instant, everything I had endured, the humiliation, the hunger, the abandonment, seemed to collide into a single dizzying moment of possibility. I felt my stomach lurch with a mixture of fear, hope, and sheer disbelief. My hands trembled, my pulse raced, and I struggled to process the enormity of what he had just said. $47 million. Me. Out of nowhere, my life had been thrown into a chaos I could hardly comprehend. The streets, the cold, the endless rejection, all of it felt suspended, irrelevant against the possibility that my destiny was about to be rewritten. I wanted to believe him, desperately, but a part of me braced for disappointment, for another cruel trick. Yet even in my doubt, a spark of excitement ignited, something I hadn't felt in months, a sense that maybe, just maybe, my life was about to turn, and I might finally claim the justice I had been denied for so long. I stumbled backward, clutching my chest as if holding my own heart in place, unable to process the words I had just heard. $47 million. Me. A part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity, while another part trembled with the fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, this was real. My mind raced, flipping through every betrayal, every moment of neglect, every time I had been dismissed or overlooked. My parents who never celebrated my accomplishments. My so-called friends who vanished when I needed them most. My ex-husband who drained me emotionally and financially. Had all of them just been erased from the equation? I wanted to scream, to demand proof, to make sense of how the universe could swing so violently in my favor after leaving me so utterly broken. Yet as I stood there shivering in the cold, the truth slowly began to creep in. The people who had ignored me, who had cast me aside, would never see this coming. I felt a strange mix of fear and exhilaration, fragile as glass, but growing stronger with each thought of what could be. The years of humiliation, the nights spent hungry and cold, the endless loneliness, they had shaped me, hardened me in ways I didn't fully understand until this very moment. My soul ached for the justice I had always longed for, a quiet reckoning that might finally tip the scales. Could a life I thought destroyed really be rebuilt in a single miraculous moment? My mind spun with plans, possibilities, and doubts. Yet beneath the uncertainty, a small, stubborn flame ignited. I would rise, and when I did, those who had dismissed me would understand the cost of underestimating me. For the first time in months, I allowed myself to imagine not just survival, but triumph. The sweet satisfaction of vindication burning just beneath the surface. The next few days were a whirlwind of disbelief and cautious excitement. I met with lawyers, signed papers I could barely comprehend, and slowly began to accept that this inheritance was real. Each signature, each official stamp, was a small hammer striking at the wall of doubt I had carried for months. I went from sleeping on a stranger's couch to touring apartments I had only glimpsed in magazines, imagining myself walking through rooms I never thought I could own. There were moments when I caught glimpses of my reflection in mirrors or the shiny surfaces of high-end lobbies, and I barely recognized the woman staring back. Her shoulders straighter, her eyes sharper, her demeanor quietly powerful. For the first time in years, I felt the subtle thrill of control, the whisper of authority that comes from knowing you hold something others desperately want but cannot touch. Those who had mocked me, dismissed me, or overlooked me had no idea this shift was happening. I remembered my ex-husband laughing at my frugality, my family rolling their eyes at my ambitions, and a quiet, almost wicked satisfaction settled in my chest. This wasn't just money, it was leverage, a means to rewrite the story they thought they controlled. I could already imagine casual encounters where I would walk past them, composed, dignified, dripping with the understated elegance they never expected from someone they had deemed powerless. The realization filled me with energy, a sense of renewal that was intoxicating. For the first time, my circumstances matched the potential I had always known I carried, and the thought of reclaiming my life on my own terms felt almost dizzying. Every meeting, every signature, every nod from a lawyer or banker whispered one truth: I was no longer invisible. The world, and those who had forsaken me, would soon see that underestimating me had been a costly mistake. The flame of determination that had smoldered through homelessness now burned hotter, fueled by the promise of justice and the first tangible taste of the power I had long been denied. Sitting alone in my new apartment, I finally allowed myself to think beyond the initial shock of wealth. I wasn't going to let this inheritance simply provide comfort. I wanted control, respect, and above all, justice. Every insult, every betrayal, every slight from the past came rushing back, and I realized it was time to plan, to strategize. I made a mental list: my ex-husband, who had treated me like an afterthought; my in-laws, whose smiles were always reserved for him; the colleagues and acquaintances who had laughed at my efforts and minimized my achievements. Each name carried its own sting, a reminder of moments where I had been dismissed, ignored, or humiliated. But this time, the narrative would be mine to write. I spent hours imagining how I could reintroduce myself into their lives, not as the discarded, powerless woman they remembered, but as someone they could not ignore or control. Every decision would be deliberate. Appearances, financial moves, and even casual social interactions became chess pieces in a game only I could see. I thought of small reversals at first, subtle hints of newfound status, luxurious accessories, quiet achievements that would slowly shift perception. And then, for the bigger players, the ex-husband and the in-laws, I considered public moments, events where their assumptions could be shattered in front of witnesses. My mind raced with possibilities, calculating timing, optics, and emotional impact. I also realized I had to protect myself from mistakes. Impulsive actions would ruin the satisfaction. Patience would be a weapon. I spent nights drafting plans, imagining encounters, rehearsing conversations, and savoring the mental image of their shock when the powerless version of me they thought they knew would transform into someone untouchable, confident and untamed by their previous judgments. By the time I fell asleep each night, a steady pulse of anticipation thrummed through me, replacing the fear and hopelessness that had dominated my life for so long. For the first time, I wasn't reacting to the world. I was preparing to command it. I began with the small things, the tangible symbols of status I had been denied for so long. A new apartment, bright and airy, with windows that welcomed the sun rather than casting shadows of judgment. Every piece of furniture, every detail was chosen not only for comfort, but for the quiet assertion of taste and control. I updated my wardrobe, carefully selecting clothes that whispered elegance rather than shouted extravagance. Clothes that would make the world take notice without feeling forced. I ventured into social spaces I had once avoided, attending gallery openings and charity events where people like me, or at least people they thought I wasn't, gathered. The first few encounters were deliciously awkward. Faces that had once carried dismissive smiles froze as they caught sight of me. Colleagues who had mocked my efforts in the office, friends who had ignored my messages, and even distant relatives who had openly favored my ex-husband, all paused, caught between recognition and disbelief. I savored every subtle glance, every hesitant greeting, every whispered comment behind polite masks. It wasn't loud revenge yet, no dramatic confrontation, but the emotional satisfaction was already intoxicating. For once I was in control, dictating the pace at which they realized my transformation. Even minor acknowledgments, polite nods, or accidental glimpses of my confidence were enough to fuel the growing fire of vindication within me. Walking through these spaces, I felt a new energy, a steady rise in self-worth and pride. It was empowering to see that the very people who had dismissed and undermined me now hesitated, unsure how to approach the woman I had become. Each subtle victory reinforced a truth I had longed to believe. The world could not ignore me forever, and I no longer needed anyone's permission to exist fully and unapologetically. The streets that had once swallowed me whole now seemed distant, irrelevant shadows behind the bright, undeniable reality I was building for myself. The first encounter with my ex-husband was accidental, or so it seemed. I spotted him at a high-end cafe I had once avoided, sitting arrogantly as if the world still owed him admiration. For a moment I considered walking past, invisible and cautious, but instead I approached with deliberate calm. His eyes widened as he recognized me. Not the same woman he had dismissed, but someone refined, confident, and clearly unbothered by the past. "Sophia?" he asked, his voice faltering. I smiled, a small, controlled gesture that carried more weight than words. "It's me," I said, casually sipping my coffee as if our history had no claim on my present. He shifted uneasily, fumbling over trivialities, his arrogance slipping in the face of my poise. Later, family members who had belittled me in years past were invited to a gallery exhibition I attended. They paused, unsure how to address the woman they had ignored, their whispers reaching my ears before their greetings. I let them sweat in discomfort, acknowledging their presence with measured politeness, never desperation. Every subtle glance, every faltering smile, became a small reversal of power, a reminder that they no longer held the narrative. I reveled quietly as my ex-husband, my in-laws, and dismissive colleagues tried to regain footing, stumbling over assumptions that had long been theirs to claim. Each interaction was a test of composure and timing, and I savored the suspense as they realized their misjudgments had shifted irreversibly. These weren't grand gestures of revenge yet, no shouting, no public humiliation, but the satisfaction of seeing their shock and uncertainty unfold was intoxicating. With every encounter I built momentum, reinforcing the contrast between their disbelief and my composed, controlled assent. In these moments, I felt the power that had eluded me for years, the slow, deliberate reclaiming of status and self-worth. Each small victory was a taste of the larger triumph to come, a reassurance that the world could no longer ignore Sophia, the woman who had once been invisible. The night of the gala, I arrived with a quiet confidence that made every head turn, not with flamboyance, but with undeniable poise. The event was buzzing with influential faces, including my ex-husband, his family, and former colleagues, all of whom had underestimated me for years. I moved through the crowd effortlessly, exchanging polite smiles while feeling the undercurrent of tension as they slowly registered who I had become. When the time came for the keynote announcement, the room hushed. The lawyer representing my inheritance took the stage, and with a deliberate pause, began recounting the story. The years of neglect, the betrayal, and finally, the remarkable reversal of fortune that had elevated a woman they had all dismissed to unimaginable status. As the audience murmured, eyes shifted to my ex-husband and family members. The whispers grew into audible gasps when it was revealed that I had not only inherited $47 million, but had also invested strategically, securing a significant influence in a company that had long been tied to my ex-husband's ambitions. His face turned pale, jaw tightening, while his smug confidence crumbled visibly before the crowd. My in-laws, who had always flaunted their approval of him over me, shrank into their seats, uncertain where to look, unsure how to reconcile the version of me they had ignored with the powerful, poised woman standing before them. Cameras flashed, social media notifications pinged, and the magnitude of the revelation spread like wildfire. Every colleague who had whispered doubts or laughed at my earlier struggles now stared in disbelief. The realization that the powerless woman they had belittled had orchestrated her own ascent was both shocking and humiliating for them. I felt a quiet satisfaction, a calm fire of vindication burning inside me as I navigated the post-announcement mingling, subtly letting my presence linger near those who had wronged me, watching the discomfort and surprise ripple through them. Their attempts at casual conversation faltered. Their jokes fell flat, and every feigned indifference cracked under the weight of the truth. I was no longer the person they had ignored. Karma, in its purest, most elegant form, had been delivered, and in that room filled with the powerful and privileged, I realized that the emotional satisfaction I had been craving for years, the recognition, the reversal of fortune, the public validation, was finally mine. The tables had turned completely, and as I raised my glass to toast quietly to my own journey, I allowed myself the briefest, almost imperceptible smile at their stunned expressions. The woman who had been homeless, invisible, and disregarded was now the center of attention, untouchable and dignified, and the weight of years of humiliation finally lifted. The applause echoed not just for the gala's cause, but for the victory I had earned, a public reckoning that had unfolded with precision and grace, leaving those who had wronged me to grapple with their own disbelief. In that moment, I felt both empowered and free, finally in control of the narrative that had long been stolen from me, and the world had no choice but to acknowledge it. Later that night, after the gala lights dimmed and the crowd dispersed, I sat alone in my apartment, letting the silence wrap around me. I allowed myself to think back to the months of despair, the nights spent shivering on streets that had once felt endless, and the countless moments I had felt invisible, dismissed, and worthless. Each memory now carried a different weight. What had once been unbearable humiliation had become the foundation of resilience. I reflected on the contrast between who I had been and who I had become. The weak, discarded woman replaced by someone powerful, respected, and capable of shaping her own destiny. The anger and shame that had consumed me earlier were now tempered by clarity and understanding. Every challenge, every betrayal, every setback had forged the strength I needed to rise. I thought of the people who had ignored me, laughed at me, or assumed I would fail, and instead of bitterness, I felt quiet satisfaction, a deep recognition that my triumph wasn't only about wealth or revenge, but about reclaiming my sense of self. I also realized how fragile that earlier version of me had been, how vulnerable to the whims of others, and how important it was to carry empathy and wisdom alongside power. In the stillness, I allowed myself to feel gratitude, for the moments of despair that taught me resilience, for the strangers who offered fleeting kindness when no one else would, and for the surprising twist of fate that had granted me a second chance. I understood that respect wasn't demanded. It was earned through action, and my journey had proven it. The quiet reflection carried a bittersweet undertone. The past could never be erased, but its pain no longer controlled me. I had grown stronger, wiser, and unshakable. For the first time in a long while, I felt complete, knowing that even in the face of rejection and abandonment, I could rise, thrive, and be seen for the person I truly was. A week after the gala, I received a letter from a young woman struggling to survive after being abandoned by her family. Her words struck a chord. Familiar despair, the same sense of invisibility I had known so well. Without hesitation, I decided to help her, allocating a portion of my inheritance to provide stability, housing, and opportunities she had been denied. Watching her eyes widen with disbelief and gratitude reminded me of my own journey, the nights I had spent unsure if anyone would ever see me. For the first time, my wealth became more than power or revenge. It became a tool to change a life, to offer hope where there had been none. In that moment, I realized that true strength wasn't just about reclaiming what was lost. It was about lifting others along the way. The satisfaction of knowing someone else could rise, just as I had, filled me with an unexpected warmth, reinforcing the emotional balance of justice and empathy I had fought so hard to achieve. Sitting in my penthouse overlooking the city, I let myself breathe deeply, taking in the life I had fought to reclaim. Every decision, every moment of patience, every ounce of resilience had led to this point. I enjoyed the comfort, the security, and the recognition I had long been denied, yet the memories of hardship lingered, not as pain, but as a reminder of how far I had come. The streets I once wandered, the nights of hunger and shame, the people who doubted me, all of it remained etched in my mind, a bittersweet backdrop to my triumph. I understood now that my strength had been forged in those moments of vulnerability, and the empowerment I felt wasn't merely about wealth or revenge. It was about surviving, growing, and emerging unshaken. In this quiet reflection, I found peace and catharsis, knowing that justice had been served, my dignity restored, and my journey honored. I was finally whole, carrying both the scars and the victories, ready to live fully on my own terms. I often think about the faces of those who once dismissed me, the ex-husband who laughed at my struggles, the family members who ignored my accomplishments, the colleagues who whispered behind my back. They didn't believe I'd survive. They assumed I would fade quietly, swallowed by misfortune, invisible and powerless. But here I am, standing tall, calm, and unshakable. They can't avoid seeing me now. Every glance they give carries the weight of realization. The woman they underestimated is no longer someone to overlook. I walk through life with a quiet confidence, letting my presence speak louder than any words, knowing the story of my resilience, transformation, and triumph will linger in their minds long after our encounters end. It's a vindication that no argument, no apology, no explanation could ever provide. I've lived the despair they once took for granted, and I've emerged not just wealthy, but empowered, respected, and whole. And as I look back, I feel a mix of gratitude and satisfaction, knowing my journey wasn't only about fortune, it was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, and my place in the world. For anyone watching, remember, even when the world casts you aside, your strength, patience, and resolve can rewrite the story. I survived, and now they'll never forget who I am.